Okay, the name of the parsha Bamidbar means in the desert, and is found in Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. In the Sinai desert, God says to conduct a census of the 12 tribes of Israel. Moses counts 603,550 men of draftable age, 20 to 60 years. The tribe of Levi numbers 22,300 males, age 1 month and older. Is counted separately. In other words, you have all the Jewish people except men between 20 and 60, and then the tribe of Levi separately. And they're also counted not from age 20 to 60, but they're counted from 30 days old. The Levites are to serve in the sanctuary. They replace the firstborn whose numbers they approximated, since they were disqualified when they participated in the worshiping of the golden calf. In other words, initially, the people who were supposed to do the service in the temple was not one specific tribe, but it was every firstborn. So, in other words, members of all tribes. But because the firstborn, together with all the other Jewish people, also sinned with the sin of the golden calf, and only the tribe of Levi refrained from the sin. So, at that point, it was determined that the Levites would no longer, that their firstborn would no um, would no longer be would no longer do the service in the temple, and instead it would be transferred to the Levites. So now they did a census of the Levites, and they did a census of the firstborn, and the numbers approximate. But then they need some sort of ceremony where their holiness transfers from the firstborn to the Levites. The 273 firstborn who lacked a Levite to replace them had to pay 5 shekel ransom to redeem themselves. Okay, when the people broke camp, the three Levite clans dismantled and transported the sanctuary and reassembled it at the center of the next encampment. So we're talking about the Jewish people did not leave Sinai yet. They're still at Sinai, and they built the temple, the Mishkan, the tabernacle at Sinai, but now they're preparing to travel. So this week's Parsha, once we take the census, tells us about how they were to travel in the desert. And that was how would they travel? The Levites would disassemble the temple and then travel and then rebuild it. Then they then erected their tents around it. The Kohanites who carried the sanctuary's vessels, the Ark, menorah, etc., in their specially designated coverings on their shoulders, camped to its south. The Gershonites in charge of its tapestries and roof coverings to its west, and the families of Merari who transported its wall panels and pillars to the north. Before the sanctuary's entranceway is to the east were the tents of Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's sons. So in other words, I read it wrong. I said Kohanites, but it was Kehatites. In other words, Levi has three families, Gershon, Kohat, and Merari. Each one had their own responsibility in the temple. Each one surrounded the temple from the three angles, three sides, and in the front was Moses and Aaron. So you have one circle around the temple with the Levites and Moses and Aaron. And then you have a wider circle, which is all of the Jewish people that we're going to read in the last paragraph. Beyond the Levite circle, the 12 tribes camped in four groups of three tribes each. So now you have the temple in the center, surrounded by the Levites and Moses and Aaron. And now you have four camps of three tribes apiece in all four directions around the temple. To the east were Judah, population 74,600, Yissachar, 54,400, and Zebulun, 57,400. To the south were Reuben, Shimon, and Gad. To the west, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And to the north was Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. This formation was kept also while traveling. Each tribe had its own Nasi, prince or leader, and its own flag with its tribal color and emblem. So there's a lot of details and a lot of specifics, and in some ways that makes this parsha very hard to connect to. What is the relevance? Do I have to know how many specific members of each tribe were there? And do I have to know where each tribe camped? But of course, everything we study has relevance to our life as well, and that's what we're going to set out, hopefully, to try to explore and try to discover. Okay, so that's by way of introduction. Now, if you want to talk about, we're starting a new book, so we like to think about the big picture and what are the books here to talk about. In a way, if you want to categorize the entire Torah, you would say as follows. In other words, in bullet points, what are the 5 books doing? So in a way, it's really the first 4 books, because the 5th book is Deuteronomy. It's the repetition. It's the second Moshe's retelling of what happened the last 40 years. So really we have four books. So what is really the big theme of each of the four books, if you could say it in one sentence? Of course, every book is full of many parshas and many themes and many ideas. But book one is the family. So you have the family of the patriarchs and matriarchs. So we're a family. And if you want to think about what's happening, we're maneuvering in the natural world. There's nothing supernatural happening. There's no revelation the way you have in the second book. So it's a family operating within the natural world, and within the world, they're coming to discover God, because Abraham discovers God on his own and passes that information on to his children, and his children are maneuvering in this world where it's a natural world. We're a family. We have a relationship with God. Okay, that's book one. When you get to book number two, two things happen. Number one, we shift from being a family and we become a nation, either in Egypt or at Sinai, depending how you think about it. And that's point one. And point two, all of a sudden, we're talking about intense holiness or revelation. Here we have things that are supernatural. First of all, the Exodus of Egypt, that's miracles, miraculous. And but maybe more importantly, it's Sinai, the Torah. God descends on Sinai and gives us the Torah. There's nothing natural about revelation. Revelation is the God coming to the human being and telling the human being something that the human being would not know on his own. So if book number one is natural, book number two is transcendent, above nature. And then, so the story is done. We built the temple, everything is fine. What happens now? So now you have book three and book four. And in a way, book three and book four are going to be the models or the archetypes of any type of living a person could do, personally, but also historically. So in other words, what's the difference between three and four? So three, where does the third book happen? Not a lot of plot, but it all happens at the tent of meeting. God spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting. In other words, book three is God's communication to Moshe in the tent, in the temple. So that's also what it's about the Jew coming to God and bringing offerings to the temple and how the priests operate in the temple. And there's also life outside the temple, but it's really outside the temple, laws of purity and impurity. How do you make sure you're worthy of coming to the temple? Or I don't want to say worthy. How do you say you're prepared to come to the temple? Or holidays, the times of the pilgrimage when you actually come to the temple. So in other words, if you want to generalize, book three is how a person comes close to the holiness of God, how a person comes close to a place of holiness. What is book four? Book four is you're not in the tent of meeting anymore. You're not in your tent, which is a protected environment, both physically and spiritually. Now you're coming to a place where you are in the desert or journeying through the desert. Now, when you journey through the desert, it's actually, you don't even have your tent because in the part of the story is how they dismantle the tent of meeting. So the third book, the second half of the second book, and the third book is all about building the tent of meeting. Now we're talking about how do you dismantle the tent of meeting? Now the purpose is not dismantling, but the purpose is journeying. You have to journey. You have to move through a landscape, both physically, but spiritually, psychologically, that is challenging. And to travel, you have to dismantle your previous abode. And really, the fourth book, even though it starts very orderly, but once they start journeying into weeks from now, all the order breaks down, and it's the most chaotic book. And it's the book where they were supposed to go right into Israel in an orderly fashion. The reality is they were delayed for 40 years. And the book concludes only 40 years later when they're at the bank of the Jordan River about to go in. So, in other words, book four is much more challenging than book three, because book three is how do I connect to God in the temple? Book four is how do I connect to God when there's chaos, when there's journeying, when there's places that are inhospitable to holiness. And that's the whole model. That's the whole Torah. That's the whole Torah. You don't need anything more. The fifth book is repetition. In other words, what am I saying? There's the first book is the natural book. Discover God through nature. The second book is discover God through revelation. Above nature, God is coming to you and revealing his presence to you. Outer worldly experience, which is every time we open the Torah, God is communicating with us. It's not stuff of the natural world. And then you have how I relate to in a holy environment, in a spiritually protected environment, and then how I operate in a challenging environment where I'm distant from the temple and I'm traveling and journeying to fulfill my purpose and the challenges that come up. And ultimately, I'm going to overcome those challenges. So, in other words, in that way, the fourth book, the first four books of the Torah really describe any scenario a person could ever reach. And what I would say is that the ultimate is the fourth book, because the ultimate is not to go into the temple. The ultimate is to travel through the world and bring the temple to every corner of the earth. That's really what's happening because they dismantled the temple. They were in the desert, but what happens when they finish journeying? The next step is they're bringing the temple and rebuilding the temple in a new place where the temple was never built. So out of three and four, even though three feels much more holy and feels much more spiritually protected, and it is a lot less chaos and a lot less distraction. But the reality is that the ultimate purpose of the Torah would be in book four. So that is just a sort of bird's eye. If you have to zoom out as much as possible and look at what are the themes of the four books and what is the transition from book two to book three to book four, I think that's one model. That's one way to think about it, and one way to think about where we're coming from and where we're headed to. Okay, so there's a lot to talk about, and there are many details that, again, create their own challenges about why are the details so important, and how do we relate to them? But we'll begin. We'll begin. What happens over here? Um, The Lord spoke to Moses. This is the beginning of the book. The Lord spoke to Moses in the Sinai desert in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after the exodus from the land of Egypt, saying, take the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel by families following their father's house, a head count of every male according to the number of their names. In other words, this is a year and a month after the Exodus, or a year and 2 weeks after the Exodus. It's the second month of the second year. We left Egypt in the first month because Passover is month number one, the 15th day of month number one. And this is going to be the the one year. 1 year later, on the first of Nisan, first of month one, they built the tabernacle, they built the Mishkan. And then a month after they built the Mishkan, we talk about the the census that occurs 1 month later, and that's part of the discussion of why census specifically at this time. Okay, so the Torah tells us who's gonna help Moses and Aaron do the census. In other words, the census is led also by the heads of the tribes. Because as we'll see later in verse 4, with you shall there be a man from each tribe, one who is head of his father's house. So in other words, every leader of every tribe would help Moses and Aaron do the census. And what's interesting is that this census, for the first time, not only are we counting people, but we're also now counting tribes. That did not happen before. In other words, this is not the first census in the Torah. In fact, it's the third census. But here, for the first time, we're talking about in verse 2, take the sum of all the congregations of the children of Israel by families, following their fathers' houses. In other words, we're not just counting how many people are totally within the Jewish people, but we want to know how many people are within each tribe. And the question is, why is that significant and why right now? So there's all kinds of ways of thinking about this. But before we do that, we're going to read the first Rashi. The first Rashi is a beautiful Rashi. Um, Rashi reads as follows. The Lord spoke in the Sinai desert on the first of the month. In other words, census. Take the census. Census. So Rashi wants to know, why do you need a census? Says Rashi, because they were dear to him, he counted them often. It's not a great translation. B'cholsha, every moment. Because the people are dear, God keeps counting them. I guess the question is, why does God need a census? God knows how many people there are. Okay, so census, you don't just count for practical purposes. You're also counting as an expression of love. If you really love something, you keep counting it. If you have a coin collection, you keep counting it. Um, when they left Egypt, he counted them. Exodus 12. When many fell because of the sin of the golden calf a few months later, he counted them to know the number of the survivors. That's Exodus 32. When he came to cause his divine presence to rest among them, he counted them. Meaning so in other words, when he left Egypt, he counted with one census. When they sinned in the golden calf, it is the second. And the third is it happens when God dwells amongst them, when he builds the Mishkan is built, and now God is going to dwell amongst the people. That's the first time. On the first of Nisan, the Mishkan was erected. On the first of Iyar, he counted them. Okay, so that's the first thing. In other words, Rashi is saying, what's the purpose of the counting? The purpose of the counting is not the a practical reason. At least from the divine perspective, Hashem knows the number. It's an act of love. It's mitoch chibasam because they were dear to him. Chiba is love, chiba is dearness. The people are dear, so God keeps counting them. Okay. So that's just interesting to see this Rashi because you contrast that with other interpretations, and there are other interpretations that give practical reasons. What are the practical reasons? So Nachmanides, for example, says, well, why are you counting only people from 20 to 60? So maybe this is related to the idea that we're about to go into the land of Israel in order to conquer the land of Israel. In other words, there's a practical purpose for this census, and that is the conquest. So if you can have an army, you can't go an army without knowing the basic numbers of how many soldiers do you have, and how many in each tribe, and how many groups you have. In other words, you can't do anything without knowing your numbers. So that's what Nachmanides says. Nachmanides says that the beginning of the counting represents the fact that we're about to enter the land of Israel. And by the way, 40 years later, at the conclusion of the book of Numbers, also there's another census, and Rashi describes why you need that census. But the Nachmanides also says, okay, now we're about to go in. Now it's practical purposes. In other words, it's interesting to see that where Nachmanides is saying that the census is primarily for the practical purposes, Rashi is being much more romantic and saying that no, the census is for expression of love. It's God wants to say, I want to know how many you are because I'm dwelling amongst you. I want a relationship with you, and counting somehow expresses that. We'll talk about how that is, but counting expresses that idea. So that's just introduction to everything else. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. Did they count only men? Because the men usually go to war, and
Correct.
if they very dear to Hashem, so why do the age limitation?
That's a good question. So it's clear that, not clear. That leads me to say that there's a little bit of both, right? Because if it's why are you counting only males 20 to 60? So Rashi doesn't. Okay, let's open the verses for a second. Let's try to get some order here, and let's try to get some order here. Okay, verse 3. From 20 years old and upwards, all who are fit to go out to the army in Israel, you shall count them by the legions, you and Aaron. In other words, it's clear that we're talking about the fact that we're saying we're counting only men, and not only just men, but men 20 to 60, is because the Torah itself tells you the reason. The reason is that because those who are fit to go out to the army. So Nachmanides' perspective is actually it's seemingly closer to the Pshat, closer to the simple interpretation. The Torah itself says count 20 to 60. And why are you counting 20 to 60? Because we're going out to battle. And when you're going out to battle, you have to know how many soldiers. And the people who are not male and not 20 to 60 are irrelevant for battle, right? Look what Rashi says. Rashi says, all who are fit to go out to the army. This informs us that no one went out to the army below the age of 20. Today you can go to the U.S. Army. I don't know, at 50, at 18. Maybe you can sign up even earlier, but there you have to be 20. So it's clear that that's what the verse says. That's a given. The question is, Rashi is looking for a spiritual interpretation, and he's saying, nonetheless, even though we're counting the army, but the act of counting could be looked at as a practical. That's for Moses and Aaron. Anyone trying to, in other words, from our perspective, if we're trying to arrange a battle, you have to know the numbers. What Rashi is saying is, if God is commanding the census, there's also what does the census mean from God's perspective? And here Rashi inserts the spiritual idea or the romantic idea that the acting is an act of love. Counting is an act of love. So my point is, both have to be true. because if it was only the act of love, you count everybody. So both have to be true, is what I'm trying to say. I hope that makes sense somewhat. Now, what's the idea of counting? Why does counting express the idea that of love? So counting has in it a paradox and um, has within it a paradox. And maybe the census over here addresses that paradox in multiple ways, as we try to show. So, in other words, what's the idea of counting? Why does counting express love? And the other question is, what do you count? In other words, what I'm trying to say is every person has their individual personality and their own individuality. But that individuality really is lost in the census because in the census, you count every person as one. Doesn't matter who the person is. It doesn't matter their financial ability. It doesn't matter their wisdom ability. It doesn't matter how righteous they are. Everybody's one. In other words, Moses, the greatest leader of the Jewish people, and any other person are both on the same level. They're both considered as one. So you could say that, what am I counting? You could say the lowest common denominator, but what the Hasidic interpretation is, you're counting what we all have in common. What do we all have in common? The essence, the core essence, the soul of every person, that's what you're counting. And if you're talking about scholarship, then one person is greater than the other person. If you're talking about physical might and physical strength, then one person is stronger than somebody else. And you can't count the same. You can't count the same of a person who's fit to go in the front of the battle to the guy who's fit to peel the potatoes, right? So if you're counting specific qualities, then you have to count differently. You're not going to give it one number for everybody. But because you're counting one number for everybody as one, it's because you are thinking about what do they all have in common? What is the common denominator? And not the lowest common denominator, but the opposite, the deepest common denominator. And that is the essence of the soul. And that the essence of the soul is the core essence is God loves it unconditionally because it doesn't matter what you do, your essence is still part of God. So that's what the Hasidic interpretation of why um, census is an expression of love. What's interesting about this census is that we also incorporate the families. And when we incorporate the families, so family is tricky because what we're saying is, on one hand, we're saying every person is one. On the other hand, we say that there are 12 tribes. And 12 tribes basically honors the fact that there are differences between the Jewish people, and there are spiritual differences between the Jewish people, and different people have different ways of living, and different people have different ways of serving God. Because the tribe affected, first of all, your maybe the region of the land that you got in the land of Israel, the region of the land that you get as your inheritance, and that also will affect your profession, whether you're in farming or you're in trade or you grow olives, depending on where you are. It all depends on what type of land you get. So what I'm trying to say is that here you have a very interesting thing. For the first time, when you have a census, on one hand, the census is telling you that everybody is equal, meaning we're looking for the parts. We're looking to celebrate the fact that what we all have in common, and that's the core, that's the essence. On the other hand, we're also telling you that every person has their own unique gift and therefore their own unique path. And therefore there are 12 tribes. Now, if there are 12, there's 613, there's 600,000. In other words, once you say there's more than not everybody is the same, then then there's 12 general differences, but within those there are everybody is unique. But what I'm trying to say is that this census for the first time it allows both for what we all have in common, but it also celebrates the differences. So that's what's unique about this census. Now, this theme is going to come up again and again in the parsha because for the first time, not only do we think about the census and we count each tribe differently, but more than any other time up to this point, from the beginning of our history, here is where, in a way, the differences between the tribes are are formalized or hardened, or it's clear that people are different because we have not read till now how the tribes are distinct. And here maybe where are you going to camp up to this point? Where would you going to camp in the desert? Wherever you want. If you want to camp next to you, somebody from a different tribe, Mazel tov, no problem. Here, for the first time, we say, no, you're a specific person within a specific tribe. This tribe is part of a group of tribes, three tribes, and it has a specific place where it's supposed to camp in the desert, and you don't go to a different place. You're specifically in this place, meaning this distinction is clarified and institutionalized. Not only that, but you actually have a flag for each tribe. So it's a visual, right? You have the national flag. There was no national flag. Now there's a national flag. There was no national flag. There was a tribal flag. And I think there was also a flag for each three tribes, every camp. So it talks about again, Ishal Digla, each person based on his flag. So could you imagine that for the first time we have 12 distinct flags? And there is no one unifying flag. At least maybe there is, maybe, but it's not written in the text. We'll try to think what that is. So this is basically what I'm trying to say is you came to the fourth book, and there's a dramatic change from what you had till now. Till now, yes, you were 12 tribes, but you didn't really see the differences. You saw the difference between maybe the tribe of the Levites. Okay, but if I'm from the tribe of Reuven or Shimon, who cares? Or that wasn't emphasized. Here, all of a sudden, we're saying on one hand, we're all the same. Every person is part of the census. We're counting everybody as one because we're counting the common denominator. On the other hand, we want to know exactly what tribe you're from. And as we get to the fourth reading of the parsha, you cannot mix easily with the other tribes. You have to camp exactly where your tribe is. And you have your own flag, and your flag is different than the other tribe. So something is happening here. The question is, what is happening? And also the question is, why is it happening right here? Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. The fact that the numbers are so specific probably highlights the fact that each tribe is unique. But do the numbers themselves mean anything?
I can't say no. I can tell you that I don't know of any specific meaning, but I can't say no. In other words, the Torah could be read on multiple levels. On the basic level, that's what the numbers were. That's how many people there were. And if you're going to battle, you have to know how many people you have. And that's why it's written. Maybe is there spiritual in addition to the simple interpretation, are there spiritual interpretations? Perhaps. But I haven't seen it. I'm sure there is, but I have not seen it. But the fact that I have not seen it is no proof whatsoever, one way or the other. Okay, so what are we thinking about here? Part of this idea is where do the tribes emerge? And where do the flags emerge? Where do the differences, where could we tolerate the differences between the tribes emerging, not just emerging conceptually, but merging in a way that's very tangible and very visible, where you have a child from one tribe and a child from another tribe, and they say, whoops, we're not part of the same, we each have a different flag. We don't even share a flag. To me, this is very dramatic or traumatic. It's traumatic. In Egypt, we were all the same. All of a sudden, here, all of a sudden, you have your own a tribe flag, and I have my own flag. We can't even share a flag. What does that tell? What does that tell you about the relationship between us? So there's a beautiful commentary. A few people say this. Who's the first one who said this? I don't know. Okay, I don't know who the first one who said it, but I think this is beautiful. Every person, as we mentioned, and we keep saying this, every person has their own individuality, their own individual path, but they're also part of a greater collective. And every culture has to balance how much we think of ourselves as an individual and how much we see ourselves as part of a collective, right? What is my identity? Am I an individual? Am I part of the tribe? Am I part of the people? Am I part of the country? How does this tension or this negotiation between me as individual or me as part of the larger group? And one beautiful commentary is as follows. Up until this point, you cannot emphasize the differences between the Jewish people. Because if you emphasize the differences too much, they may all break apart. You have this flag, you have that flag, that you're going to live in this part of Israel, you're going to live in that part of Israel, you're going to be a banker, you're going to be you're going to get involved in commerce, you're going to get involved into farming. If you highlight the differences too early, then you're going to lose the cohesive story and you're going to break up the people. when does this census emerge? And this census is the census where finally, for the first time, they're being counted by tribe. And like I said, they're giving the flags, so it's a visual as well. This census can only emerge once they build the temple. And it has to be a full month after they build the temple. They built the temple first of Nisan, they do the census first of ER. So the theme of the temple has to sink in. And then you have the visual of the temple in the center, and then the tribes all around the temple. And that's the idea. Once you're grounded, once you're anchored by the temple, once all tribes are oriented toward the temple, because even if I'm on east, you're the east of what? East of the temple. And if you're west of what? You're west of the temple, etc. So wherever you may be, your specific quality is within the larger context. And the larger context is the context of the temple, your relationship with God and your relationship with the Torah. So we're all part of the same story because even though we each have an individual flag, but there's an overarching theme, and the overarching theme is our relationship with the temple. So that's why specifically when you have a strong um, anchor, which is the temple, which is connects all the Jewish people, now you could highlight the differences because it's true. I have my own individual path. You have your own individual path, but our individual path is part of a larger story, and the temple is the symbol of that larger story. So I think that's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful interpretation. Now, taking that to a little, saying that a little bit differently, or within the human soul as well. Um, this is from the Kli Yakar. I said it in the past, but I think it's very beautiful. On one hand, the way the Torah introduces the way the Torah introduces the camping around the desert, it introduces it linear. It has to. You can only speak about one person at a time. So it's first the tribe of first the flag of Judah, etc. So it has to mention all four. On the other hand, the Torah is telling you that when you make a circle, in other words, who is closer to the temple? The whole idea of having the temple in the center, as opposed to having the temple in the beginning of the line, you could think the temple should be the temple should be in the front, right? You come to synagogue, you have the ark, and the ark is all the way in the front, Mizrach in the east, if you're living west of Israel. And historically, all the important people sat in Mizrach, sat in the east. And then I can gauge my place in the community is how many rows back they asked me to sit. So even in Yiddish culture, the idea of sitting in Mizrach, sitting in the east, because it's very clear the temple, the ark is up front. And then if the ark is in the front, so then there's already a hierarchy, how far you are or how close you are to the temple. But that's only if the ark is in the front. What happens if the ark or the temple is what seats the Torah, seats the Ten Commandments, seats the ark, which houses the Torah? Um, what happens if that's in the middle of the camp? If that's in the middle of camp, then every tribe is just as close to the center as the other one. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, the Torah introduces them in a certain order. So when you introduce them in order, presumably the first one is the greatest. So this leads the Kli Yakar to say something very beautiful. So he says, generally speaking, if you have to generalize, every tribe has their own theme, correct? But we have now four camps. And he says these four camps emphasize four different types of qualities. And these qualities are universal qualities that every person to some degree wants to cultivate. I guess most people. And every person within themselves can have all these four qualities. What are the four qualities that the Kli Yakar enumerates? So if I remember correctly, he says wisdom. Wisdom is important, maybe most important. Judah's wisdom, so wisdom is most important. He says there's a hierarchy. There's wisdom. Then there's good character, midot, character refinement, someone who's kind, someone who's emotionally present for other people. So that's emotional character development. That's number two. Then you have physical strength. Physical strength is very important. Is it more important to being a mensch or more important to be able to lift 100 pounds? Okay, so that's a good question. And you have wisdom, you have emotional development, you have physical strength, and then finally you have wealth. Wealth is the lowest. Why is wealth the lowest? Everybody wants to be wealthy, or most people do, because ultimately wealth is what's more important to be. If a person could say, you'll be very wealthy, but you'll be very sick. So already King Solomon in Proverbs says, Kol asher leish yitin ba'ad nafsho, a person will give up all his money to save his life. Right? If you tell me, so ultimately, health is going to be more important than wealth. So you have these four categories. You have wisdom, you have emotional development or relationships, which is in the heart. Then you have physical strength, and then you have um, wealth, physical wealth. And he says that each group of three tribes excel in one of these categories. And then what the Kli Yakar says, which is the most interesting, is on one hand, you could say there's a hierarchy. You could say Torah study is the greatest, and wealth is the least important, and health is also important, and then character development is also important. But there's a hierarchy: wealth, emotion, wisdom, emotion, physical strength, and physical material wealth. On one hand, there is a hierarchy. On the other hand, the moment you put the Torah in the center, in other words, if you're going to say that all those qualities are here to relate to the Torah, and the purpose of all these qualities is to live out the values of the Torah, then they're just as close to the Torah. In other words, if you say, why do I want physical health? I go to the gym, I work out, I spend my time. Why? And the answer would be, if the answer is because I want it for its own sake. So it's very important, but it's number three. It's a very important thing, but it's number three. But if you say, I want to be physically healthy so that I can serve God, so that I can expand the values of the temple and bring the temple to my life, then the physical health is just as important as the spirit, as the wisdom, or even material success is just as important as the wisdom, because material success, when viewed in its for its own sake, is number four. Still important, but it's number four. But material success, so that I can live the values of the Torah, then that's the irony. There's two ways, not irony. It's the sort of the paradox. There's two ways of reading it. On one hand, it's the final camp. It's the final one that's listed. On the other hand, because the temple is the center, that's why. So it's just as close as the other ones. So that's what the Kli Yakar says about all the tribes. Now, if you want to think about this, if you want to think about this specifically, you could think about this in the context of within the person's own life. So every person wants a little bit, has multiple values. And the problem with the different values that a person lives, I want to be a good father, I want to be a good spouse, I want to be a good successful person, I want to be a good student, I want to learn, I want to grow, I want money, I want health, I need time for the gym, I need time for the library. The question now becomes, how do I balance all of these different values? Because they're contradictory to an extent. The more time I spend in the gym, the less time I have for the library. The more time I spend trying to earn money, the less time I could take care of my health. So the question is, I have these competing values. And people, there's an inner struggle, an inner tension, or people are being pulled in different directions. And that creates fragmentation, that creates a feeling of being unsettled, of constantly being pulled at with these different things that I want to achieve. So, but if you apply the model of the Kli Yakar and then you say these are contradictory if there's no one overarching theme. But if the overarching theme is I relate to the temple is in the center, serving God is in the center, then going to the gym and going to work and going to study and going to study and developing my relationships, then these are not contradictory. And it's not like one is better than the other. Then they could sort of find their balance because they're all anchored with the center, which is the Torah. So how do I compete different values within the Jewish people and within myself is by organizing all these values around the Torah. And then, so how much of this is necessary? Well, it depends. It depends on my specific lifestyle, etc. But it also depends how this relates to my overarching purpose. And my overarching purpose is the center of my life, the anchor of my life, which that is the Torah. So I think that's beautiful.
It is. Both of those ideas are very beautiful and very relevant today because the first idea that you have to be centered, that everything you can, the being Torah being a center kind of allows for freedom of
Yeah.
self-expression.
When you have the anchor, then I could say, and also not just self-expression, but also allows for community. In other words, if we have if we have a shared story, then when I go and do my thing and you go you do your thing, we're enhancing each other. And then it's not a threat to the connection that we have. But if we don't have a strong feeling of connection to begin with, then you doing your thing and me doing my thing separates us.
Yeah, the beauty of it is you only um, appears where in the travel when we have Torah in the center. Then
Right,
only then we can have different
right,
flags.
right.
That's and the second one about the priorities in life. Everybody has different priorities, but being centered around the values around the Torah
Yes.
helps you to organize them.
Yeah. And then in a way they also organize naturally, meaning to say you could say it allows you to negotiate between them, how much time to allocate for each one. But also, I think if you're really anchored, then the sense of conflict in the beginning doesn't rise as much, right? Because it's not a contradiction as much. I see them as part of a greater whole. I need to be healthy. I need to have material success. I need to study Torah. But there's an organizing reason behind all of this. And I think that, so I think I don't see them as conflicting to begin with. In other words, if I see my life, here's what I'm trying to say. If I see it as a dichotomy, they're trying to achieve spiritual success and material success is a conflict. So whenever I'm doing one, I'm feeling guilty about how come I'm not doing the other, because I'm totally separated from the other, if you see what I'm saying. But if I see that there's an anchor that really unites all of them, and all of them are just as close to the center of the anchor, so to begin with, I'm not so the conflict is less because when I'm in the marketplace or when I'm in the gym, I'm also connecting to God. So to begin with, the conflict is not as strong because I don't see it as opposites that have no connection. I see them as different parts of a circle, so to speak. And circle, every part of the circle is just as close to the center point of the circle. So I think that the sense of conflict to begin with does not arise as powerfully. I would say maybe perhaps. Okay. The next thing that the Torah spends a lot of time about is the idea of the Levites. And there's a lot of discussion about the Levites. And what's most interesting about the Levites is there's two points of the Levites. First of all, the Levites are counted from 30 days old. Now, why 30 days old? This is a little tragic. In the ancient world, until a child was 30 days, you didn't know if the child was going to survive. It was very common for children to die either at birth or right after birth. It was called a nefel, so one who falls. It was very common. And therefore, you didn't really know that the child is what the Talmud would call bar kayama, someone who's going to survive until 30 days. So essentially, when you say count someone at 30 days, you're basically saying at birth. So the Levites are counted as from birth, and the Israelites are only counted from 20 to 60. So right there, the question is, how come? Are the Levites more special? Are they more holy? In what way? Well, they are more holy, but I thought you're counting to go to battle. So how come with them you're not counting to go to battle? So that's one problem. Another problem is the Levites themselves, you also have to count two censuses. In other words, they counted how many Levites there are from 20 days old, from 30 days old. In addition, they also had another census, which is counting the Levites from age 30 to age 50, which was the age that they actually served in the temple. So, in other words, while every Jew had only one, while the Israelites only had one census, and that census was when they're ready for battle, when you could do something practically, when we can use you for the purpose of what we need right now, which is battle. The Levites, on one hand, you say, we're counting everybody. On the other hand, you say, we're counting, what even the Levites were only counting, we're counting a second time from 20 to from 20 to, from 30 to 50. So even before we figure out what this all means, right away, it says, okay, so what is the question arises right away? In other words, even if we don't have the answer, we have to ask, so what's the significance of this and what's the symbolism of this that the Israelites are counted from 20 to 30 and the Levites are counted from 30 days old. So Rashi begins to try to address this. And maybe there are other interpretations as well, but we'll start with Rashi. It's always good to start with Rashi. We'll hide Rashi's commentary for right now just to find it. This goes to, I think, the fifth reading. Who knows? Um, okay, let's see if there's any Rashis here that are interesting. Well, all Rashis are interesting, but for our context. Okay, so Rashi says, well, I thought he says elsewhere. I have to find it. But even before that, Rashi addresses right away the anomaly of the counting of the Levites from 30 days old. So I'm reading at what chapter are we in? I'm reading chapter 3, verse 15. Verse 15 or 14, the Lord spoke to Moses in the desert, in the Sinai desert, saying, Count the children of Levi according to their father's house, according to their families. Count all males from the age of 1 month and upward. So right away, 1 month, that's news. Up to this point, chapter 1 and chapter 2, we only counted Jews from 20 to 22 to 60. What happened in 1 month? So Rashi says as follows. When he is no longer in the category of possible premature birth, he is counted among those called keepers of the holy charge. Okay, so in other words, he's already Shomer, keepers of the holy charge. Literally, Shomer, he's guarding, Mishmeret HaKodesh, the holy guarding. So I think Rashi explains it elsewhere. He's already doing service. He's already doing service from 30 days old. How is he doing service in 30 days old? Rashi says, because he's guarding the holy service. He's keeping the holy charge. He's guarding the holy service. What does it mean? He's guarding the holy guard. So what it means is that the Levites, later on, it says that the Levites camped around the desert. It says, camped around the temple. It says they have to protect the Jewish people. Jewish people shouldn't come close. Because if you come too close to the temple, it's dangerous, as we read with the sons of Aaron. So the Levites surrounding the camp, the temple, they're like guarding. They're like the guards. They're security guards, and they're performing the service of sort of creating this barrier between the rest of the people and the temple, because you want the temple in your midst and your anchor, but there has to be some distance. You can't just show up whenever you want. You need preparation, etc. The Levites are that guard. Now, the Levites themselves, how old you have to be to serve as a separator? And in some sense, it doesn't matter what age. You're 30 days old, but you're there. You're the barrier. If you're the barrier, you're already performing a service. So I think that's what Rashi's saying in the first half. And then we get to go back in history and we talk about a beautiful interpretation. Rav Judah, the son of Rabbi Shalom, said that tribe is accustomed to being counted from the womb, as it says, whom she was born to Levi in Egypt. As she entered the gate of Egypt, she bore her Yocheved, yet she, Yocheved, was counted as one of the 70 souls. For if you count the total, you find only 69, but she completed the number. Midrash Tanchuma Bamidbar 16. What's happening is like this. It talks about how Levi gave birth when the Jewish people came, in the book of Genesis, talks about how the Jewish people came to the land of Egypt, and they were 70 souls. The problem is, and it lists all 70 souls. The problem is that it doesn't say there were no 70 souls, there were only 69. And the verse talking about Yocheved, Levi's daughter, it's a tricky verse because it says 60 descended. Sorry, 70 descended. The problem is that it says that Yocheved was born in Egypt. So if she's born in Egypt, she's not counted as part of the 70 who descended. So there, the Medrash explains that Yocheved was born between the gates. In other words, as they entered Egypt, that's where she was born. And she's the daughter of Levi. So what turns out is she was counted the moment she was born. And that's what the Medrash says here. The tribe of Levi represents is accustomed to being counted as soon as they're born, and therefore later on in history, they're also counted as soon as they're born. What does that mean? What's the significance? Um, what does that mean? What is the significance? What that means is like this. If you really want to think about this a little bit more abstractly, there's two ways to think about a person and what their value is and what the value to Hashem is. And both are true. There's the idea that there's an unconditional bond, there's unconditional value, and that's represented by the Levite who's learning at who's Levite who's counted as 30 days old, a child 30 days old. I can assure you did nothing. And then there's the model where you count it again when you're 30 to 50. In other words, you're thinking about, yes, I have unconditional value, but am I cultivating my talents and am I expressing myself and doing something, accomplishing my mission into this world? And that's a different thing. So then you're counting a person reaching a certain age, and that represents achievement. So in other words, we're celebrating the unconditional connection to God, and we're also celebrating the achievement that a person achieves through their own effort. And both of those are important, and both of those have value. Because if you tell someone you're only as valuable as what you achieve, you are undermining their unconditional value. But if you tell someone you have unconditional value, so then why do I have to do anything? And the answer is it's both are true. You have unconditional value, but nevertheless, or maybe because of that, God wants you to express that in a certain specific way that is consistent with your specific purpose. And therefore, when we have the double senses for the Levi, what we're really doing is we're honoring both of those aspects, the unconditional value, as well as the value of achievement and growth and productivity. So that's the story in short. So much more to say on this parsha, but we'll begin from here. Hopefully, this is meaningful and enjoyable, and let's continue the journey through the book of Numbers, through the desert next week, God willing, in good health. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Meaningful and enjoyable. Uh, One question about Levites. At 30 years old, there was no assessment. You just counted, and that's it. But for us, it's a sign that you.
Yeah, yeah. Even then, but what are we counting? We're counting those who are capable of work. That's the thing. Also, battle. I'm sure not everybody was in the front line, but 20 to 60 means you're capable of battle. So we're counting you because of a certain skill or because of a certain need that you fill, right? And now I'm sure not everybody worked in the temple the same way. The Levites in the temple, some saying, well, not everybody's saying, only people with good voices, right? But the point is, the moment you say, I have to wait till you become 30 or I have to wait till you become 20, what I'm really saying is, I'm counting you for a specific purpose. When you say I'm counting you at 30 days old, that's unconditional. It's not tied with any achievement or any milestone that you're reaching, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, it does. But for us today, it means
Yes.
that
For us
that's
today, it's figurative. It's
yeah,
figurative. We
it's
look at ourselves
figurative.
as there's the fact that I'm alive is already a service. There's two things. There's the Levites, 30 days old, they're already serving God just by existing, right? So the Jew, you would serve God just by existing. You're a soul on this earth. No matter what you do, you're 30 days old, meaning you're going to exist in this world. That just by existing in this world, you're already meaningful.
It's
And
your
then there's what you
birthright.
achieve. That's the first census. And then there's what you achieve. And they're both true and they're not contradictory. And in fact, they enhance each other. Okay, thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.